Welcome to a deep dive into the world of design. And no, we're not talking about like the latest fashion trends or, fancy gadgets or anything like that. We're going to be exploring something much more relatable. We're going to be exploring the design of everyday things.
Yeah.
So we'll be using Donald Norman's The Design of Everyday Things, the revised and expanded edition as our guide.
Okay.
Have you ever wrestled with a door that seemed like impossible to open?
All the time.
Or like felt utterly defeated by like a confusing stovetop?
Yes.
You're not alone.
Hmm.
Those everyday frustrations are exactly what Norman tackles in his book. And today we're going to kind of try to uncover like the hidden language of objects
Yeah.
and why good design is about so much more than just aesthetics.
You know what's so fascinating about Norman's work is that it's not just for designers.
Yeah.
It's for everyone.
Yeah.
We all use everyday objects. So understanding how design impacts our interactions is incredibly insightful.
Absolutely. And he doesn't even dive into like complex theories right away. He starts with these relatable, almost comical examples of design gone wrong.
Oh, yeah?
Doors that make you feel like you need an engineering degree just to open them.
Right.
Faucets that seem to have a mind of their own.
Yeah.
He even calls it the psychopathology of everyday things, which I think is such a brilliant way to grab our attention
Mm-hmm.
and make us realize that maybe, just maybe it's not us.
Yeah.
It's the design.
That's a key point. It's about shifting the blame from the user to the design itself.
Yeah.
Think about it. How many times have you struggled with something and thought, I must be doing something wrong?
Yeah.
When in reality, the design was setting you up for failure.
Oh, all the time. And that's where Norman's concept of the gulfs comes in, right?
Yeah.
The gulf of execution and the gulf of evaluation. Can you explain those a bit further?
Of course. The gulf of execution is that gap between what you want to do with an object and what the object actually allows you to do. Think about a door with no handle. The gulf widens because you're left wondering, how do I even open this thing?
Right. And then there's the gulf of evaluation, the gap between what you think happened based on your actions and what actually happened. Like that time I tried to turn on the shower
Yeah,
and I ended up soaking the entire bathroom because I couldn't figure out which way to turn the knob.
exactly. Those are perfect examples of how poorly designed objects create those wide gulfs, leaving you feeling frustrated and, let's be honest, a little bit incompetent.
It's like the design is playing a cruel joke on us. But here's the thing. Norman argues that good design bridges those gulfs, making our interactions with objects intuitive and enjoyable. And a big part of that is using effective signifiers.
Yeah, signifiers are those visual cues that guide our actions. Think of a simple push or pull sign on a door. It seems so basic, but it eliminates the guesswork and frustration. Good signifiers make things obvious, preventing those "am I doing this right" moments.
Yeah, like the design is communicating with us, saying, hey, this is how you use me.
Right.
And when those signifiers are missing or unclear, that's when we end up pushing on doors that are meant to be pulled, or turning on the wrong burner on the stove.
Speaking of stoves, Norman even includes a photo in the book, figure 1.4, of a hotel sink that wouldn't drain. Because the design was so confusing, you couldn't figure out if he was supposed to push a button, pull a lever, or perform some secret handshake to make the water go down.
See, even design experts get tripped up by bad design. And this brings us to another key concept, constraints. And this might sound counterintuitive, but Norman argues that constraints, those limitations on what we can do, are actually helpful in design.
Think of it this way. Constraints guide our actions and reduce the chances of making errors. Imagine assembling a Lego motorcycle. Those pieces only fit together in specific ways. Those physical constraints ensure you're building it correctly.
Okay, I can see how that works with Legos, but how do constraints apply to everyday objects? Is it like saying, let's make this door really hard to open so people don't accidentally walk into the wrong room?
Not exactly. Norman outlines 4 types of constraints: physical, cultural, semantic, and logical. We've already talked about physical constraints, the shape of a key only fitting into a specific lock, for example. Cultural constraints rely on societal norms. Driving on the right side of the road is a cultural constraint. It creates order and prevents chaos.
So cultural constraints help us predict how others will behave, making things safer and more efficient.
Right.
Got it. What about semantic constraints?
Semantic constraints rely on the meaning of the situation.
Okay.
You wouldn't put a car's windshield wipers on the back window. It just doesn't make sense. The meaning of the situation guides the design. And lastly, logical constraints. Using reason to figure out the correct action. Like knowing that if you're missing one piece of a puzzle, it must be the last one left in the box. Precisely. All these constraints work together, almost like a hidden language, to make our interactions with the world smoother and more predictable.
So well-designed objects are almost like a well-written instruction manual. But instead of words, they use physical cues, cultural norms, and logical relationships to guide our actions.
That's a great way to think about it. And when those constraints are well designed, our interactions become intuitive, almost effortless. We don't have to think too hard about how to use things, it just feels natural.
This leads us to another crucial aspect of good design, respecting our limited memory capacity. I mean, let's be honest, our brains can only handle so much information at once.
That's where Norman's concept of knowledge in the head versus knowledge in the world comes in.
Yeah.
Some things we need to memorize, like our phone number or important dates. But many things can be communicated through the design itself.
So instead of trying to remember which burner corresponds to which knob on the stovetop, which, let's be honest, is a design flaw that's been around forever, why not design the stovetop in a way that makes the connection obvious?
Exactly. Norman uses the example of Professor Sayeki and his motorcycle's turn signal switch. He had trouble remembering which way to flick the switch, but he eventually created a mental model, a story in his head that connected to the design and made it easier to remember.
So he essentially hacked the design by creating a meaningful association. It's like when you use a mnemonic device to remember a list of items. You're creating a connection that helps the information stick.
Good design should leverage these natural mappings, where the controls are arranged to mirror the layout of the things they control and provide clear feedback. For example, a distinct click when you turn something on confirms that your action had the intended effect.
So it's like having a helpful guide whispering in your ear saying, you're doing it right. And this brings us to a core argument of the book, human error is often the result of bad design.
What we often label as human error is actually a failure of the design to anticipate and accommodate human behavior. It's not that we're inherently clumsy or forgetful.
Right.
It's that the things we use are sometimes designed in ways that make it easy to slip up.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not about eliminating all errors, because we're human after all, but about minimizing the consequences of those errors and making it easier to recover from them.
Exactly. It's about designing systems that work with human nature, not against it.
Okay.
And that's where understanding the different types of errors comes in. Norman talks about slips and mistakes and how recognizing these patterns can lead to more forgiving designs.
Can you give us some examples of those errors? I'm curious how those play out in real life.
Certainly. Imagine you're so used to grabbing your briefcase on your way out the door that you accidentally unbuckle your wristwatch instead.
Oh.
That's a memory lapse slip. You intended to grab your briefcase, but your memory, distracted by your routine, failed.
I've done that before. It's like your brain is on autopilot and it just grabs the closest thing that fits the general shape and size of what you're expecting.
Exactly. And then there are mode error slips, where the meaning of a control changes depending on the system's state. Take the tragic example of the Airbus accident caused by confusion between different control modes.
That's a chilling example of how even highly trained professionals can fall victim to poorly designed systems, especially when you consider the role of interruptions in our modern, always-on world.
Oh, yeah.
Our lives are full of distractions, yet designs rarely account for this reality. We're constantly switching gears, trying to remember where we left off and piecing together our intentions. No wonder errors happen.
It's true.
It's like trying to read a book while someone keeps slamming it shut every few minutes. You'd never get through it. So how do we design for a world of interruptions? Do we need to create distraction-proof bubbles where we can focus without any outside interference?
While that sounds appealing, it's not very realistic. Instead, we need designs that provide clear reminders, easy ways to resume tasks, and safeguards against unintended actions when we inevitably get interrupted.
So it's about creating designs that are more resilient, flexible, and forgiving, knowing that interruptions are a part of modern life.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. But let's be realistic. Sometimes people are at fault, right?
Yeah.
We can't always blame the design.
You're absolutely right. There are instances where human actions are the primary cause,
Okay.
especially when facing extreme pressure or deliberately violating safety procedures.
Right.
Consider the KLM and Pan Am runway collision. Multiple factors contributed to that disaster, including miscommunication, weather conditions,
Right.
and unfortunately, the KLM crew's decision to take off without clearance.
So it's a complex interplay of design, human behavior, and external factors. But even in those situations, we can learn from those tragedies and strive to design systems that are more resilient and account for the potential for human error.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another important aspect of design, the future. How does Norman see technology shaping design in the coming decades? We have artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and who knows what else is around the corner.
Right. The possibilities seem endless. Will we all be living in smart homes that anticipate our every need, or will we be overwhelmed by technology that's more complex and confusing than ever?
It's a question worth pondering. Norman acknowledges the rapid pace of technological change, but he also points out the tension between adding more and more features, what he calls featureitis, and maintaining usability.
Oh, I've definitely experienced that. Sometimes my smartphone feels like it has so many features that I can't even find the basic functions anymore.
That's a common problem.
Yeah.
And it raises the question of whether all these features actually improve our lives or just make things more complex and overwhelming. It's like the QWERTY keyboard. We're still using a design from the typewriter era, even though it's not the most efficient layout.
Talk about legacy design. So how do we strike a balance between innovation and usability in this ever-evolving technological landscape? Do we need to go back to basics and rethink everything, or is there a way to integrate these new technologies thoughtfully?
It's a challenge that designers are grappling with. Norman suggests focusing on the core needs of users and designing technologies that augment and support those needs rather than simply adding bells and whistles for the sake of novelty.
So it's about being mindful and intentional about how we integrate technology into our lives, rather than just chasing the latest shiny object. Like,
Mhm.
how can this technology truly make our lives easier, safer, and more enjoyable?
Exactly. It's about designing for human well-being and empowerment, not just for technological advancement for its own sake. And that brings us to an interesting question. What about the future of books in this digital age?
Right. With e-readers and online platforms becoming increasingly popular, will traditional books become obsolete? Will we all be reading on screens, or is there still a place for the printed page?
Norman sees potential in the evolution of books. He envisions a world where they become more interactive and multimedia rich, incorporating videos, animations, and even virtual reality experiences.
That sounds incredible. Imagine reading a novel where the characters come to life, or a history book that transports you to different time periods. It would be like stepping into the story itself.
It's about blurring the lines between reading and experiencing, and it opens up exciting possibilities for storytelling, education, and knowledge sharing. But of course, with these advancements come ethical considerations.
Yeah.
We can't just ignore the potential downsides.
Right, like the environmental impact of producing all these digital devices, or the concerns about data privacy and surveillance.
Those are important points. Norman stresses the moral obligations of designers, particularly regarding sustainability and data privacy. It's not just about creating cool gadgets, it's about considering the broader impact of our creations on society and the planet.
So it's not just about aesthetics or functionality. It's about designing with a conscience. And that's a responsibility that we all share, not just designers. We can all make choices that support ethical and sustainable design practices.
Absolutely. And that's where informed consumers come in. By being aware of the ethical implications of design, we can demand better from the companies we support and the products we choose.
This deep dive is really making me think differently about the everyday things I encounter. It's amazing how much thought and intention, or lack thereof, goes into the design of the objects and systems we use.
And this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore in Norman's book and in the field of design as a whole.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the psychology of everyday actions to the future of design in a technologically advanced world. But before we move on, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. If technology can augment our memory and cognitive abilities, what does this mean for the skills we value and cultivate as humans? If we can offload more and more mental tasks to machines, will we become intellectually lazy? Or will it free up our minds for higher level thinking and creativity?
It's a question worth pondering. If we can rely on technology to remember things for us, to navigate for us, to even make decisions for us, what does that mean for our own cognitive abilities?
It's almost like a double-edged sword. Technology can make our lives easier, but it can also make us dependent. So how do we strike that balance? How do we leverage technology's power without losing our own?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And it's one that we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into the world of design and technology.
Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll continue to unpack these fascinating concepts and see how they apply to your everyday life.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
Hmm.
As technology advances, it can both enhance and potentially diminish our own abilities. It's like we're in a constant dance with technology, figuring out how to lead and follow at the same time.
Exactly. And speaking of how our minds work, Norman dives into like the nitty-gritty of our thought processes in the book. He talks about how we process information and make decisions even when we're not consciously aware of it.
He breaks down human thought into three levels: visceral, behavioral, and reflective. Each level plays a distinct role in how we interact with the world, including how we respond to design.
Okay, let's unpack those. Visceral is like our gut reactions, right?
Yeah.
That immediate sense of attraction or repulsion we feel towards something.
Precisely. It's driven by our senses and basic instincts.
Yeah.
Think about how you feel when you see a beautifully designed product. That immediate wow factor, that's your visceral response.
So it's like our emotional, almost primal reaction to something. Then there's the behavioral level. Is that where our learned skills and habits come into play?
Exactly. This is where we act almost automatically based on patterns and routines we've developed over time. Driving a car is a great example. Once you've learned, you don't have to think about every little step. It becomes almost subconscious.
Like muscle memory for our brains.
Yeah,
And finally, there's the reflective level. Our conscious thought process where we analyze, plan, and make deliberate decisions.
think of it as the executive level of your mind, where you weigh options, consider consequences, and make choices based on your goals and values. It's the part of you that reflects on your experiences and learns from them.
So it's like we have these different layers of thinking working together, from our gut reactions to our carefully considered choices. And I'm curious, how do these levels interact in practice? Are they always in harmony or can they conflict?
That's a great question. And it's where things get really interesting. Sometimes these levels work in concert, but other times they can clash. Imagine you see a delicious-looking pastry in a bakery window. Your visceral level is saying, eat it, but your reflective level might remind you that you're trying to eat healthy.
That's a battle I face on a regular basis, but it highlights how our decision-making isn't always straightforward. We're influenced by our emotions, our habits, and our conscious thoughts, all vying for control.
And good design understands these different levels of thinking and aims to create experiences that appeal to all three. A visually appealing product might draw you in on a visceral level, but it also needs to be functional and easy to use on a behavioral level. And on a reflective level, it might connect to your values or aspirations.
This makes me think about those impulse purchases we sometimes make. You see something that looks amazing, you buy it,
Yeah.
and then later you're like, why did I do that? I don't even need this. It's like our visceral level hijacked our better judgment.
That's a perfect example of how our different levels of thinking can sometimes lead us astray. And it highlights why good design is so important. It can help us make more informed choices even when our emotions are running high.
Okay, so we've got these three levels of thinking going on. But here's something I've always wondered. Why do we tend to blame ourselves when things go wrong, even if it's the design's fault?
That's something Norman calls blaming the wrong thing. And it stems from a deep-seated belief that the world is logical and predictable. When things go wrong, we assume we must have done something to cause it, rather than questioning the design itself.
It's like that classic sitcom scenario where someone walks into a sliding glass door because it's so clean they didn't see it, and instead of blaming the design, they're embarrassed and think, oh, I'm such a klutz.
Exactly. It's easier to blame ourselves than to admit that the world can be unpredictable or the designs can be flawed.
It's almost like we have this innate desire to maintain a sense of control, even when it means taking the blame for something that's not our fault.
And that tendency to self-blame has implications for how we design. If we understand this human bias, we can design things that are more forgiving, anticipating potential errors and providing clear guidance to help users avoid them.
So it's about creating designs that are more compassionate and understanding of our human fallibility. Instead of punishing us for our mistakes, they guide us towards the right actions.
Precisely. It's about designing systems that work with human nature, not against it.
Okay, so we've explored how our minds work and how that impacts our interactions with design. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the real-world challenges of design. It's one thing to have these great ideas and principles, but how do they actually play out in a world of deadlines, budgets, and competing priorities?
That's where the rubber meets the road, as they say. And Norman dedicates a whole chapter to design in the world of business.
So he acknowledges that design doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's influenced by market forces, technological advancements, and the internal politics of companies.
Exactly. And sometimes those forces can lead to decisions that prioritize profit over usability or aesthetics over functionality.
Like those frustratingly complex office copiers that seem designed to make you pull your hair out.
Right.
Or those websites with endless pop-up ads and confusing navigation. It's like they're deliberately trying to make our lives harder.
Well, maybe not deliberately, but certainly not with the user's best interests in mind. Norman points out that often the people making purchasing decisions aren't the ones who will be using the products.
That makes sense. If you're not the one who has to use the clunky software or navigate the confusing website, it's easy to overlook those usability issues.
Exactly. And that disconnect can have real consequences for the people who end up having to interact with these poorly designed products day in and day out.
It's like buying a car based solely on its looks, and then realizing it's incredibly uncomfortable to drive or gets terrible gas mileage. You might love the way it looks in the driveway, but the everyday experience is a nightmare.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the importance of considering the entire user experience, not just the initial appeal or the bottom line.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we ensure that user needs are prioritized in the design process, even when there are other pressures at play?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And it requires a shift in thinking, both on the part of designers and the companies that hire them. It's about recognizing that good design is good business.
Because happy users are more likely to be loyal customers, right?
Exactly.
If a product is easy to use, solves my problems, and makes me feel good, I'm more likely to recommend it to others and buy from that company again.
And it's not just about consumer products. It applies to services, systems, even public spaces. Well-designed environments can reduce stress, increase efficiency, and promote well-being.
This is making me realize that good design is so much more than just making things look pretty. It's about solving problems, making life easier, and creating positive experiences.
And it's about recognizing that design impacts everyone, regardless of age, ability, or background. Which brings us to another challenge Norman discusses: designing for a diverse population.
Right. With billions of people in the world, each with their own unique needs and preferences, how can designers possibly create products that work for everyone? It seems like an impossible task.
It's certainly a challenge, but Norman offers some insightful perspectives. He talks about the importance of understanding human capabilities and limitations, regardless of individual differences.
So there are some universal principles of design that apply to everyone, regardless of their background or abilities.
Exactly. For example, our short-term memory capacity is limited, so design should minimize the need to rely on memory. Our perceptual systems are attuned to certain patterns and cues, so designs should leverage those natural tendencies to make things more intuitive.
It's like designing a door that opens when you push on it just makes sense, regardless of your cultural background or physical abilities.
Precisely. There are certain design principles that are universally applicable based on our shared human nature. But of course, there are also cultural and individual variations to consider.
Right. What works in one culture might not work in another, and what's accessible for one person might be a barrier for someone else.
And that's where user research and testing become crucial. It's about understanding the specific needs and contexts of the people who will be using the product or service.
So it's a delicate balance between universal principles and tailored solutions. You need a deep understanding of both human psychology and the specific context of use.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process. Good design is never truly finished. It's constantly evolving to meet the changing needs of users and society as a whole.
This is making me think about the concept of accessibility in design. It's not just about making things usable for people with disabilities, it's about making things usable for everyone, regardless of their abilities or limitations.
That's a great point, and it's something that's often overlooked. We tend to design for the average user, but in reality, there is no average user. We all have different needs, preferences, and abilities.
So good design is about being inclusive and recognizing that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. It's about creating designs that work for everyone, not just a select few.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that our needs change over time. What works for us when we're young and healthy might not work for us as we age, or if we experience an injury or illness.
This is making me realize that good design is about so much more than just aesthetics or functionality. It's about empathy, understanding, and a commitment to creating a world that works for everyone.
And it's about recognizing that design is never neutral. It has the power to shape our experiences, influence our behaviors, and even impact our well-being.
That's a powerful thought. Design isn't just about creating things. It's about shaping the world we live in.
And that's a responsibility that we should all take seriously, whether we're designers, consumers, or simply citizens of this world.
Well, this conversation has been incredibly insightful. We've explored how our minds work, the real-world challenges of design, and the importance of designing for a diverse population.
We've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover in Norman's book and in the field of design as a whole.
Stay tuned for part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll explore the future of design, the ethical implications of technology, and how you can become a more conscious and engaged consumer in a world that's increasingly shaped by design. So we've been talking about how design impacts our lives in so many ways, often without us even realizing it, and how sometimes designs aren't created with the user's best interests in mind.
It's true. We've discussed how market pressures and technological advancements can sometimes lead to designs that prioritize profit over usability. But let's shift our focus now to something a bit more hopeful, the future of design.
Okay, so looking ahead, what does Norman see on the horizon? Are we headed towards like a design utopia where everything is intuitive and enjoyable to use, or are we destined for a future of even more frustrating and confusing products?
Well, Norman paints a somewhat mixed picture. He predicts a shift from the design of everyday things to the design of superfluous, overloaded, unnecessary things.
Oh no, does that mean we're doomed to a future of even more confusing remotes, gadgets with a million useless features, and websites that take forever to load? It sounds a bit bleak.
It's certainly a risk,
Mhm.
especially with the relentless pressure to add more and more features, what he calls featureitis. But it doesn't have to be that way. Norman also believes that design has the power to make our lives better if we approach it thoughtfully.
So it's not about rejecting new technologies outright, but rather about being more mindful and intentional about how we integrate them into our lives.
Exactly. It's about asking ourselves, does this new feature truly enhance the user experience? Or is it just adding complexity for complexity's sake?
Yeah, I think about all the times I've bought a new gadget, lured in by the promise of all these amazing features, only to realize that I only use about 10% of them. The rest just add clutter and confusion.
That's a perfect example of what Norman is cautioning against. It's about resisting the temptation to add bells and whistles just because we can, and instead focusing on creating designs that are truly user-centered.
So what does that look like in practice? How can we as consumers advocate for better design? Do we write angry letters to companies, start petitions, become designers ourselves?
Well, all of those options are on the table, but it starts with awareness. Noticing those design flaws in our everyday lives and understanding why they're problematic.
Like that door handle that's impossible to grip, or that website that makes you click through endless menus just to find basic information.
Exactly. Once we start paying attention, we can begin to articulate what good design looks and feels like. And then we can use our voices and our choices to demand better.
So it's about becoming more design literate, not just as designers, but as consumers and citizens. We need to understand the impact of design on our lives and advocate for a world that's more intuitive, enjoyable, and human-centered.
And it's about supporting companies that prioritize usability and accessibility. Vote with your wallet, so to speak. Choose products and services that are well designed, and provide feedback to companies when they miss the mark.
Yeah. It sounds like becoming a conscious consumer is a big part of this. We can't just passively accept whatever designs are thrown our way. We need to be more discerning and demand better from the companies we support.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of your voice. Share your experiences, both good and bad, with others. Write reviews, post on social media, and start conversations about design. The more we talk about it, the more awareness we raise.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on design and the role it plays in our lives.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, design isn't just about aesthetics or functionality. It's about creating a world that works better for everyone. It's about solving problems, improving lives, and making the world a more enjoyable and equitable place.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the design of everyday things.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. Hopefully you've gained some new insights into the power of design and how you can be a more conscious and engaged consumer in a world that's increasingly shaped by design.
I know I have. I'm going to start paying more attention to the designs I encounter in my everyday life, and I'm definitely going to be more vocal about the things I like and don't like.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, even small changes can make a big difference. By simply being more aware of design and advocating for better experiences, you can contribute to creating a world that's more human-centered and enjoyable for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of design. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep demanding better.